This is the primary objective. We push through the jungle here and secure the crossroads by 0600. There will be no retreat.
Move up! Move! Let's go! Keep moving towards the tree line!
Keep the supplies moving off the LCVPs. All right, men, push forward. We have a runway to build.
Fleet Bravo is now entering the Rivas engagement zone, Admiral.
Confirmed. All units proceed as planned.
There's a map I want you to picture. It is a map of the Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water on Earth, covering more than 60 million square miles, stretching from the coast of California to the coast of Asia, from the Aleutian Islands in the north to Antarctica in the south. On this map, the islands are dots, tiny dots, most of them specks of land so small that you could walk across them in an afternoon, surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean in every direction. Some of them you have heard of: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Most of them you have not. Inuitak, Kwajalein, Paliliu, Ulithi, Angar, Tinian. Their names are unfamiliar to most people today, but the men who fought on them, who crossed those beaches and drove through those jungles and took those hills at a cost that is difficult to comprehend even now, understood that each of those tiny dots on the map was a step in a strategy that was designed not to defeat Japan on every island it had fortified, but to bypass most of them, isolate them, cut them off from supply, and strangle Japan's ability to project power outward from its home islands. The strategy was called island hopping. The men who fought it sometimes called it leapfrogging. Its architects, Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific, and the joint planning staffs in Washington, who argued endlessly about which approach was right, understood that the Pacific War could not be won by fighting every battle. Japan had fortified hundreds of islands across a vast arc of the Pacific that stretched from the Aleutians in the north through the Central Pacific to the Southwest Pacific and back toward the Japanese home islands. Taking every one of them, in order, would have required resources that even American production could not supply on the necessary timeline, and it would have taken years that the strategy did not allow. So they didn't take every one. They took the ones that mattered, the islands with harbors or airfields or strategic position that made them necessary for the next step of the advance. The islands they bypassed, and there were many of them, containing large Japanese garrisons that had been fortified and supplied at considerable cost. They left. They cut off the supply lines. They let the Japanese defenders sit on their islands with their fortifications and their weapons and nothing to do with any of it, because the war had moved past them and their island was no longer relevant to anything. Some of those garrisons were still in place when the war ended. Some of the men on them didn't learn the war had ended until weeks or months after the surrender. This was not a comfortable strategy for the people being bypassed. It was not comfortable for the Japanese garrisons who found themselves cut off and slowly starving on islands that American forces had simply walked around. And it was not entirely comfortable for the American commanders who designed it, because bypassing a fortified position means leaving a potential threat at your back, and military culture is not instinctively comfortable with that. But it was the right strategy for specific geography and the specific resources of the Pacific War, and the men who saw it clearly and implemented it despite the discomfort were right. I want to tell you the story of how the island hopping strategy was developed, how it was executed, and what it cost, because the cost was real and it matters for understanding what the Pacific War actually was. And I want to tell you about the specific islands and the specific battles and the specific people who fought them, because the strategy is abstract, but the fighting was not. The strategy is the architecture, the men who fought it with a substance. Before I do that, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. The Pacific War is one of the most consequential and least understood campaigns in modern history, and the stories on this channel try to do justice to the complexity and the cost of it. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and come back for every episode. And now back to the Pacific. Back to 1942 and the beginning of the Island Campaign that would eventually bring American forces within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The logistical foundation of the island-hopping campaign is the dimension of the story that receives the least attention, but without which none of the rest was possible. Moving an army across the Pacific Ocean, keeping it supplied, fueled, armed, fed, and medically supported across thousands of miles of open ocean, while simultaneously fighting the campaign, was a logistical achievement that had no precedent in military history, and that required organizational innovations that were developed, in many cases, in real time as the campaign progressed. The problem was distance. The United States in 1942 was roughly 5,000 miles from Guadalcanal. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every artillery shell, every sea ration, every spare part for every aircraft and ship and vehicle that participated in the Guadalcanal campaign had to travel that distance from American production facilities to the island. The supply line stretched from the factories of the American industrial heartland to ports on the West Coast, across the Pacific to the logistical bases in the South Pacific. Noumea in New Caledonia became the primary base, and then forward to the operating forces. The Navy's Service Force Pacific, which managed the fleet's logistical support, developed the concept of underway replenishment to a degree of sophistication that American naval logistics had never previously achieved. Underway replenishment, the transfer of fuel, ammunition, and supplies from supply ships to warships, while both are underway at sea, allowed the fleet to sustain operations in remote areas without returning to base between missions. The development of the fast fleet oiler and the ammunition ship, and the techniques for transferring their cargoes at sea in the conditions of the Pacific, was a continuous engineering and operational effort throughout the campaign. By the later stages of the war, American carrier task forces could operate for extended periods without returning to base, sustained by a constant flow of supply ships that met them at sea and transfer what they needed before heading back to the rear bases for more. The CBs, the Navy's construction battalions, were the instrument through which the physical infrastructure of the island campaign was created. After each island was secured, the CBs moved in immediately behind the combat troops and began constructing airfields, harbor facilities, roads, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and the base infrastructure that would support the next operation. The speed at which they worked was extraordinary. On Tinian, the CBs had the first runway operational, within days of the island being declared secure, and had the full airfield complex. 6 runways capable of supporting 29 operations, completed within months. The airfields that the CBs built on the successive islands of the Central Pacific Drive were the platforms from which the bombing campaign against Japan was conducted. The medical system that supported the island campaign was another organizational achievement that receives insufficient attention. Tropical diseases, malaria, dengue fever, scrub typhus, and a range of intestinal illnesses were as significant a cause of casualties as Japanese weapons in some operations. The Army and Navy medical services developed protocols for disease prevention and treatment in tropical conditions, deployed medical units forward with the combat forces, and established the evacuation system that moved wounded men from the forward areas to field hospitals, to base hospitals, to hospitals in Hawaii and on the mainland with a speed and efficiency that saved many lives that would have been lost in any previous war. The advances in blood banking, surgical technique, and trauma care that the war produced, advances driven by the practical necessity of treating large numbers of casualties under field conditions, transformed American medicine in ways that were still being felt decades after the war ended. The techniques for whole blood transfusion, for early debridement of wounds, for management of infection with the newly available sulfa drugs, and eventually penicillin, all of these were developed, refined, and systematized during the Pacific Campaign under conditions that forced innovation at a pace peacetime medicine could never have achieved. The role of naval aviation in the island campaign extended far beyond the direct support of amphibious operations. The carrier task forces that Admiral Nimitz deployed in the Central Pacific served as the advance guard the entire campaign, striking Japanese air bases and naval installations ahead of each amphibious assault, reducing the Japanese air forces that would otherwise have contested the landings, and maintaining the air superiority that allowed the amphibious forces to come ashore without being destroyed on the beaches. The Fast Carrier Task Force, Task Force 58 and its successors, was the most powerful naval aviation force in history to that point. Built around the new Essex-class carriers that American shipyards were producing at a rate that would have seemed impossible before the war, the Fast Carrier Task Force could project air power across hundreds of miles, striking targets simultaneously at multiple locations, sustaining operations for weeks without returning to base. The Japanese naval aviation that had been so formidable at Pearl Harbor and through the early months of the war had been progressively ground down. At Coral Sea and Midway, and in the Solomons Campaign, and in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, until by 1944 and 1945, the Japanese carrier force was a shell, its surviving aircraft and their replacement pilots unable to match the quality and quantity of American naval air power. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, fought simultaneously with the Saipan landings, was a decisive carrier battle of the Central Pacific Campaign. The Japanese attempt to defeat the American invasion of the Marianas by committing their remaining carrier force to a decisive engagement resulted in the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers and a loss of roughly 600 aircraft and their crews, losses the Japanese carrier aviation could not replace. American aviators called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the disparity in losses. After the Philippine Sea, Japan had no carrier air force capable of challenging American operations. The Fast Carrier Task Force could operate essentially without fear of Japanese naval air opposition in the final year of the war. The submarine campaign that ran in parallel with the island-hopping drive contributed to the strategic strangling of Japan in ways that were not immediately visible but were cumulatively devastating. American submarines, operating from bases in Pearl Harbor and later in the Marianas, attacked Japanese merchant shipping across the Pacific with increasing effectiveness as the war progressed. The Japanese merchant fleet, the lifeline that connected Japan's home islands to the oil, iron ore, rubber, and other raw materials of the territories it had conquered, was being progressively destroyed. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. The consequences were visible in Japan's industrial production. Without adequate supplies of oil, Japan's aircraft and ships could not operate. Without adequate supplies of iron ore, Japan's steel production declined. Without adequate steel, Japan's shipbuilding, aircraft production, and weapons manufacturing all suffered. The submarine campaign did not receive the publicity of the island campaigns. It was conducted invisibly, far from any audience, but its contribution to the defeat of Japan was as significant as any of the amphibious operations that captured the public attention. The specific experience of Marines who fought the island campaign, the men who crossed the beaches and cleared the jungle and reduced the cave complexes and climbed the volcanic peaks, was shaped by conditions of combat that were, in important ways, unlike anything the American military had previously encountered. The Japanese military culture of 2,600 years of warrior tradition produced soldiers who fought with a tenacity and a willingness to die rather than surrender that American forces found difficult to comprehend and impossible to negotiate with. The standard practices of warfare, the white flag, the negotiated surrender, the taking of prisoners, were largely inapplicable in a conflict where the opposing force had been trained to consider surrender a disgrace and death in combat an honor. This reality shaped the tactical conduct of the island campaign in ways that produced outcomes that are difficult to assess from a contemporary perspective. The low rate of Japanese prisoners, the high proportion of Japanese defenders who fought to the last man rather than surrendering, was partly a product of Japanese military culture and partly a consequence of the way the fighting was conducted on both sides. Some Japanese soldiers who attempted to surrender were killed. Some American soldiers who took prisoners were killed by prisoners who had concealed weapons. The mutual ferocity of the Pacific Ground Campaign was not simply a product of racism or hatred on either side. Though these were present, it was a product of a military culture on one side that made surrender almost impossible, and the adaptation of the other side to a war in which the normal rules of combat did not apply. The physical conditions in which the Pacific Island fighting was conducted, the tropical heat, the jungle vegetation, the volcanic terrain, the insects and the disease, added dimensions of suffering to the combat that the statistics of killed and wounded do not capture. A Marine on Guadalcanal in September 1942 was simultaneously fighting Japanese soldiers, defending against malaria, subsisting on inadequate rations, and functioning in heat that would incapacitate most people who had not been conditioned to it. The men who sustained that fight for 6 months, who held the airfield and the perimeter against everything the Japanese threw at them, were not supermen. They were young men from American towns and cities who had been given a mission and who performed it under conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. The photographers and journalists who accompanied the island campaign, including Joe Rosenthal, whose flag-raising photograph at Iwo Jima is the most famous image of the Pacific War, and the reporters who filed dispatches from Guadalcanal and Tarawa and the subsequent operations, serve as a human connection between the fighting and the American public. Their work, within the constraints of military censorship, brought the reality of Pacific Island fighting to an audience that would otherwise have had only official accounts in government statistics. The photographs that showed the dead on the beaches of Tarawa, published in Life magazine in the winter of 1943, the first photographs of American war dead to be published since the beginning of the war, produced a reaction that was simultaneously grief and resolve. The public understanding that the war was costing American lives, and costing them in ways that required being seen and acknowledged, was an important part of the political foundation of the continued war effort. The veterans of the Pacific Island campaign came home, many of them, carrying wounds that were not visible in any physical examination. The specific psychological trauma of Pacific Island combat, the close quarters fighting, the cave clearing, the witnessing of death at intimate range, the months of sustained stress in conditions of tropical disease and inadequate supply, produced what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder in proportions that the military medicine of the time was not equipped to treat. The men who came home from Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Okinawa returned to a country that was grateful and celebratory and largely unable to understand what they had experienced. Many of them never talked about it. Their silence was its own kind of cost. The first major American offensive operation in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor and Midway was not the product of a grand strategic plan. It was an improvisation driven by a specific threat that had to be addressed before it became a larger problem. In August 1942, American intelligence reported that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, a large island at the southern end of the Solomon Islands chain. An airfield on Guadalcanal would give Japanese aircraft a range to threaten the supply lines between the United States and Australia, the lines that were sustaining the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, and that were essential to any future offensive. The airfield had to be denied to Japan. The Marines were sent to take it. The Guadalcanal campaign that followed was 6 months of fighting that tested the American military in ways that the previous months of the Pacific War had not. The Marines who landed on August 7, 1942, the first American offensive ground action of the Pacific War, took the airfield quickly and then spent the next 6 months fighting to keep it. The Japanese responded to the American landing with ferocity and a determination that the American commanders had not entirely anticipated. They ran supply convoys down the slot, the body of water between the two chains of the Solomon Islands, in night runs that American forces tried and frequently failed to stop. They landed reinforcements. They launched night attacks against the American perimeter. They contested the waters around Guadalcanal in a series of naval battles that cost both sides dearly. The American victory at Guadalcanal was not clean or easy. The Navy lost more ships in the waters around Guadalcanal than it had lost at Pearl Harbor. The Marines and Army soldiers who fought the ground campaign did so in conditions of tropical heat and disease and malnutrition that were, in some respects, as dangerous as the Japanese defenders. Malaria and other tropical diseases put more men out of action than Japanese weapons in some periods of the campaign. The fighting in the jungle, close, dark, confusing, where the enemy could be invisible at 10 meters, was unlike anything American forces had trained for and required a rapid and brutal adaptation. But the Americans held the airfield, and the airfield was what mattered. Henderson Field, named for a Marine aviator killed at Midway, became the platform from which American aircraft could contest the air over Guadalcanal and the surrounding waters. The Japanese were unable to reinforce their ground forces adequately because the daylight runs down the slot were too costly in the face of aircraft from Henderson Field. The night runs that got through were not enough. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was eventually evacuated in February 1943, a skilled withdrawal that removed most of the surviving troops. But the island was American, the airfield was secure, and the first step up the Solomon Islands chain had been taken. The Solomon Islands campaign that followed Guadalcanal demonstrated, in practical terms, what the leapfrog strategy meant for the men who executed it. The American advance up the Solomons was not a linear progression from island to island in sequence. It was a series of selective operations, taking the islands with airfields or anchorages that were needed for the next operation, bypassing the islands that could be isolated and left. The Japanese defenders on the bypassed islands could not interfere with the American advance because they had no air support, no resupply, no ability to project force beyond perimeter of their own positions. They were effectively prisoners on their own fortifications, waiting for a relief that never came. The Central Pacific Drive that Admiral Nimitz launched in November 1943 was the most direct application of the island hopping strategy at scale. Nimitz's plan was to advance across the Central Pacific through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and then to the Ryukyu Islands, a chain of operations that would bring American forces within bombing range of the Japanese home islands and cut Japan off from the oil and raw materials of the territories it had conquered in Southeast Asia. The advance was designed to bypass the heavily fortified islands of the Japanese defensive perimeter wherever possible, taking only what was needed for the next step. The first test of this strategy at the division level was the assault on Tarawa in November 1943. Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, specifically the island of Bidio, which is less than a square mile in area, was defended by 4,700 Japanese troops in fortifications that the pre-landing bombardment had not significantly damaged. The assault by the 2nd Marine Division encountered fire from the moment the landing craft approached the beach. The reef that surrounded Bidio caused many of the landing craft to ground well short of the beach, forcing Marines to wade through hundreds of yards of water under direct fire. In 76 hours of fighting, the Marines suffered nearly 3,000 casualties, killed and wounded, taking an island that could be walked across in 15 minutes. Tarawa was a shock. The casualty figures, the photographs and the newsreel footage that reached the American public for the first time showed the reality of Pacific Island fighting in ways that previous coverage had not, produced a reaction that combined horror at the cost with questions about whether the strategy was right. The answer that the commanders gave, and that history has largely validated, was that Tarawa was necessary, that the lessons it taught about amphibious assault, about the inadequacy of pre-landing bombardment, about the need for new weapons and new techniques, were essential for the larger operations to come. The men who died on Bidio paid a price that made it possible to take the Marshall Islands with lower casualties, and the Marianas with lower casualties still, as the techniques improved, and the equipment improved, and the commanders learned what worked. The Marshall Islands campaign in February 1944 demonstrated the improvement. The lessons of Tarawa had been applied: heavier and more accurate pre-landing bombardment, better landing craft, better coordination between naval and air support and the landing forces. The assault on Kwajalein Atoll, the largest atoll in the world, was accomplished with casualties roughly a third of what Tarawa had cost for comparable objectives. The assault on Eniwetok followed, and then the planners turned to the next step, the Marianas. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were the strategic prize of the Central Pacific Drive. They were large enough to accommodate the airfields and the base facilities that the B-29 Superfortress bombers would need to reach the Japanese home islands. Taking the Marianas would put the Japanese home islands within range of the most powerful strategic bombing aircraft ever built. The Japanese understood this, which is why they fought for the Marianas with a determination and a cost that exceeded any previous operation in the Central Pacific. The battle for Saipan in June and July 1944 was the largest ground battle of the Central Pacific Campaign to that point. The island was defended by roughly 31,000 Japanese troops, well fortified and determined to hold at any cost. The American Assault Force, 2 Marine divisions and an Army division, ultimately more than 67,000 men, fought for 3 weeks in terrain that ranged from beaches to jungle to sugarcane fields to the volcanic hills of the island's interior. The fighting was close and brutal, with the Japanese defenders using every feature of the terrain to slow the American advance and exact the maximum possible cost. The battle for Saipan produced one of the most disturbing episodes of the Pacific War. As American forces advanced to the northern tip of the island in the final days of the battle, hundreds of Japanese civilians, families of settlers who had been brought to Saipan in the pre-war decades, threw themselves from the cliffs at the island's northern end rather than surrender to American forces. They had been told, by Japanese propaganda, that Americans tortured and killed prisoners. Many of them jumped. American soldiers and Marines who witnessed this were horrified and attempted to prevent it. But the cultural gulf between the American forces and the Japanese civilians was too great to bridge in the chaos of battle. The fall of Saipan had consequences that extended far beyond the island itself. The loss of Saipan, a Japanese territory, unlike the Marshall Islands and Gilberts, which had been mandated territories since the First World War, was a political shock that contributed to the fall of Prime Minister Tojo and his cabinet. The Japanese government that replaced Tojo's was marginally more open to the idea of a negotiated end to the war, but the institutional and cultural forces within Japanese society that demanded continued resistance were still overwhelmingly dominant. The war continued. Tinian, the island adjacent to Saipan, was taken in a brilliant operation in late July and early August 1944. The assault on Tinian was a model of the amphibious art. A feint at the obvious landing beach combined with the actual landings at two small beaches on the northern end of the island that the Japanese had considered too small to be viable assault points. The Marines who came over those small beaches caught the Japanese defenders out of position and took the island in 9 days with relatively light casualties. Tinian was then converted into the largest airfield complex in the world, from which the B-29 bombing campaign against Japan would eventually be conducted. The airfields on Tinian were the platforms from which the Enola Gay and Bockscar would depart for Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Guam, the third major island in the Marianas, had been an American territory before the war. It had been captured by Japan in the days after Pearl Harbor, and its retaking in July and August 1944 had a particular emotional resonance for the American forces that was different from the earlier Central Pacific operations. Guam was American soil, and taking it back meant something to the men who fought for it that the more remote Pacific atolls did not. The Guamanians, who had lived under Japanese occupation for 2.5 years, and who helped American forces navigate the island's terrain, contributed to the operation in ways that the American military recognized and honored. The Peleliu operation in September 1944 is one of the most controversial operations of the Pacific War. The island of Peleliu in the Palau Group was assaulted by the 1st Marine Division and subsequently the 81st Army Division in an operation that was expected to take 3 or 4 days and instead lasted more than 2 months. The Japanese defenders of Peleliu had abandoned the tactics of the Banzai Charge that had characterized earlier island defenses. The suicidal mass attacks that were tactically predictable and costly for the attackers, but which the attackers could eventually defeat, and replace them with a defense in depth based on the island's cave systems and ridge lines. The Marines advancing into the Umurbagal mountain complex found a labyrinthine network of fortified caves and tunnels from which the Japanese defenders could fight, withdraw through connecting passages, and reappear somewhere else. Clearing the cave complexes required direct assault with flamethrowers and demolitions, cave by cave, passage by passage, at a cost of Marine lives that the operations planners had not adequately anticipated. The question of whether Peleliu was necessary has been debated by military historians ever since. The strategic justification for the operation, that Peleliu needed to be taken to secure the flank of MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines, was challenged at the time and has been questioned since. MacArthur's own operations in the Philippines proceeded without the Japanese garrison on Peleliu posing any significant threat to his flank. The men who died on Peleliu, more than 1,700 American killed and 8,000 wounded, died for an objective whose necessity was, at minimum, debatable. This does not diminish their courage or their sacrifice. It is simply a fact about the strategy that should be part of the record. The 2 Jima operation in February and March 1945 was, by contrast, strategically unambiguous. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in area lying roughly halfway between the Marianas and Japan, was needed for specific operational reasons. Its airfields were being used by Japanese fighters to intercept the B-29 bombing missions, and the island could serve as an emergency landing field for B-29's damage on missions over Japan who could not make it back to the Marianas. Taking Iwo Jima was not optional given the requirements of the bombing campaign. The assault on Iwo Jima by the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, with the 3rd Marine Division in reserve, was the largest Marine operation of the war. The island was defended by 22,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, who had applied the same cave defense doctrine that had made Peleliu so costly and refined it to a degree that even Peleliu had not demonstrated. Iwo Jima's volcanic geology provided natural cave systems that the Japanese had developed into an underground city of tunnels and bunkers connecting hundreds of fighting positions. The pre-landing bombardment, the heaviest of any Pacific Island operation, did relatively little damage to the underground fortifications. The Marines who landed on February 19th, 1945 came ashore onto black volcanic sand and found themselves in what their commanders later described as the most heavily fortified position in the history of warfare. The fighting on Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. The Marines suffered 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded, the highest casualty rate of any Marine operation in the war. The Japanese garrison fought essentially to the last man. 18,000 of the 22,000 defenders were killed, and only approximately 1,000 surrendered. Admiral Nimitz's famous observation that among the Americans who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue, was not rhetoric. It was a statement of fact about what the men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions did in 36 days on an island that is 8 square miles of volcanic rock. The photograph that Joe Rosenthal took on the 5th day of the battle, the image of 6 Marines raising the American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi, became the most reproduced photograph of the war and one of the most recognized images in American history. It was taken in the middle of the battle, with the fighting continuing around the men in the photograph, and it captured something about the meaning of the Pacific Campaign that statistics and strategy could not convey. The human effort, the physical strain, the specific people who were doing the specific thing that the strategy required. Okinawa, the final major island operation of the Pacific War, was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific theater, larger even than Normandy in terms of the forces involved and the duration of the fighting. The assault by 5 Army and 2 Marine divisions in April 1945 was opposed by 110,000 Japanese troops in fortifications prepared over months, fighting a defense-in-depth strategy that traded space for time and American casualties, with the aim of inflicting losses so severe that the American public and political leadership would find the cost of invading the Japanese home islands unacceptable. The Okinawa campaign lasted 82 days. American ground casualties exceeded 12,000 killed and 38,000 wounded. The Navy, which had to maintain its position off Okinawa throughout the campaign to support the ground forces, suffered its highest casualties of any Pacific operation from the kamikaze attacks that the Japanese launched in waves against the fleet. More than 400 American ships were damaged by kamikaze strikes and 34 were sunk. The kamikaze campaign at Okinawa was, from the Japanese perspective, a demonstration of what the defense of the home islands would look like, a preview of the cost that an invasion of Kyushu or Honshu would exact. The MacArthur dimension of the Pacific War, the Southwest Pacific Campaign that ran in parallel with Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive, add a dimension to the island hopping story that is sometimes underemphasized. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific area, conducted a campaign along the northern coast of New Guinea and then into the Philippines that was geographically different from the Central Pacific Drive, but strategically complementary to it. Where Nimitz's approach was a series of amphibious assaults across the open ocean, MacArthur's was an advance along the coast of a single large landmass, using amphibious operations to leap ahead of Japanese defensive positions and bypass concentrations of Japanese troops that could be left to wither. MacArthur's campaign was not without controversy. His personal style, the theatrical self-promotion, the insistence on the Philippines as the primary objective, the conflict with the Navy over resources and priority, generated tensions that affected planning at the highest levels. His famous promise to return to the Philippines after the fall of Bataan in 1942 was a political commitment that shaped American strategy in ways that military logic alone would not have dictated. The debate between the MacArthur approach, advance to the Philippines, and the Nimitz approach, bypass the Philippines and take Formosa or the Chinese coast as the base of the final operations against Japan, was resolved in favor of MacArthur at a conference in July 1944, and the Philippines campaign that followed was as costly as its critics had predicted. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the naval battle that covered the American landings on Leyte in the Philippines, was the largest naval battle in history. The Japanese committed virtually their entire remaining fleet in a complex, four-pronged attack designed to destroy the American landing force and reverse the strategic situation in the Pacific. The battle involved hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft over 4 days of fighting across a vast area of ocean around the Philippines. It ended in a decisive American victory. The Japanese fleet lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and thousands of irreplaceable aircrew that effectively ended Japan's ability to challenge American naval supremacy. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy could not contest the sea lanes that American forces were using for the island campaign. The outcome of the war had been determined, if it had not been determined before. The liberation of the Philippines, completed in August 1945 after months of fighting on Luzon and in the Manila area, was among the costliest campaigns of the Pacific War. The Battle of Manila in February and March 1945 was a brutal urban battle in which American forces fought the Japanese defenders street by street through a city that was largely destroyed in the process. More than 100,000 Filipino civilians died in Manila during the battle, killed by Japanese troops who conducted massacres in the city's civilian areas as American forces closed in, or caught in the crossfire of the fighting, or killed in the fires that consumed the city's wooden structures. The liberation of Manila was a moment of political importance for MacArthur and for American policy in Asia. Its human cost was a tragedy that the military narrative of liberation cannot fully contain. The strategic debate about island hopping, about which islands to take, in what order, at what cost, was never finally resolved during the war. The ongoing argument between MacArthur and Nimitz, between the Army and the Navy, between the advocates of different routes to Japan, continued through the final operations of the war. The compromises that were made, taking Peleliu when its necessity was questionable, fighting for Manila when the city could arguably have been bypassed, investing in the Philippines campaign at the expense of other options, were the products of political and institutional forces as much as pure military logic. The Pacific War was planned and fought by human beings with careers and reputations and institutional loyalties, and those factors shaped the decisions in ways that purely strategic analysis could not fully predict or prevent. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 rendered moot the plans that were being developed for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Operation Downfall, which rejected casualties in the hundreds of thousands to the American forces and millions for the Japanese defenders and civilians. Whether those projections were accurate, whether the atomic bombs were necessary to achieve Japanese surrender, whether alternatives existed that could have ended the war without either the bombs or the invasion, these questions remain genuinely contested among historians and will not be resolved here. What is not contested is that the island hopping campaign created the strategic situation within which the decision was made, and that the men who fought that campaign on both sides of the Pacific bore a cost that should not be forgotten in the complexity of the strategic arguments. The islands that were fought over in the Pacific campaign have, in the decades since the war, developed complex relationships with a history that was imposed on them. Guadalcanal, where the campaign began, has a war museum in Honiara that preserves artifacts and memories of the fighting, maintained by a local population that has its own relationship to the events of 1942, as bystanders, sometimes as participants, always as the people who lived on the island before the war arrived and after left. Iwo Jima, where the fighting was most intense in proportion to the island size, holds a ceremony each year, attended by American veterans and Japanese veterans and their families, that acknowledges the cost on both sides without fully reconciling the contradictions of how and why the battle was fought. The veterans of the island campaign, the men who crossed the beaches and cleared the caves and raised the flags, came home to a country that honored them in the general sense without always understanding the specific sense of what they had done. The greatest generation, as they had come to be called, were not asking for understanding. Most of them were asking, quietly and with a particular stoicism of their generation, to be left alone to live their lives and put the war behind them. Many succeeded. Some could not. The islands they had fought on remained with them in ways they could not fully leave behind, in ways that surfaced in the small hours of the morning for years after the war, and that shaped their lives and their families' lives in ways that no official account of strategy and operations can fully capture. That is what the island-hopping war was. A map of tiny dots across 60 million square miles of ocean, each dot a battle, Each battle a cost, the whole adding up to a strategic victory that changed the world. The men who paid that cost deserve to have the full story told. Not just a strategy, which was right, and not just the victories, which were real, but the price, which was immense, and the people, who were everything. The island hopping campaign that had begun at Guadalcanal in August 1942 ended at Okinawa in June 1945. In 3 years of fighting, American forces had advanced from the southern Solomons to the threshold of the Japanese home islands, a distance of roughly 4,000 miles, accomplished through a combination of amphibious assaults, carrier air operations, submarine interdiction, and the logistical achievements that kept the advance moving. The strategy had worked. The bypassed Japanese garrisons were cut off and irrelevant. The supply lines to the Japanese home islands were severed. The B-29 bombing campaign was reducing Japanese cities and industry to rubble. Japan was defeated in every material sense before the atomic bombs were dropped. The human cost of the island hopping campaign was real and must be part of the reckoning. More than 36,000 Americans were killed in ground combat in the Pacific Island campaign, with many more wounded, and additional thousands killed in the naval battles and air operations that supported the ground campaign. The Japanese losses were vastly greater. On Iwo Jima alone, Japan lost 18,000 to 22,000 defenders. On Okinawa, the Japanese military lost more than 100,000 killed, and an estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians died in the fighting, caught between two military forces on their island, in a battle that neither force had fully planned for the civilian population to survive. The men who executed the island hopping strategy, who fought on Bidio and Kwajalein and Saipan, and Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, did not fight for strategy. They fought for the man next to them, for the immediate and concrete objective in front of them, for the particular piece of ground that their particular unit had been assigned to take. The strategy was the frame. The fighting was the substance. And the substance was as hard and as costly and as genuinely terrible as any fighting in the history of warfare. The strategic geography of the island hopping campaign created conditions for a particular kind of psychological warfare that is rarely discussed alongside the conventional military operations. The Japanese garrisons that were bypassed, left on their islands without resupply, watching the American advance move past them, faced a situation that had no precedent in Japanese military experience or culture. The warrior code that required fighting to the death assumed that fighting was possible, that the enemy was present, that the opportunity to die honorably in battle would be provided. On a bypassed island, the opportunity for honorable combat was denied. The garrison sat and waited and slowly starved, with no prospect of relief and no framework for understanding their situation in terms that Japanese military culture had prepared them for. Some of these garrisons continued to resist for months or years after the war ended, unaware that the surrender had occurred. The most famous of these holdouts, Hiro Onoda, a Japanese officer on Lubang Island in the Philippines who continued guerrilla resistance until 1974, when his former commanding officer flew to the island and formally relieved him of duty, became symbols of loyalty and a dedication that the post-war world found simultaneously admirable and incomprehensible. Onoda had spent 29 years in the jungle, maintaining the mission he had been given, in the absence of any information that the mission had been superseded by a different reality. The island had bypassed him in a different sense than the strategic bypass had intended. The cultural encounter between American military forces and the populations of the Pacific Islands they moved through was another dimension to the campaign that shaped long-term consequences. The Pacific Islanders who had lived under Japanese occupation, in some cases for years, in some cases for only months before the American advance reached their islands, experienced liberation in ways that did not always match the American narrative of freedom and democracy. The American forces that arrived with their vast material wealth and their casual generosity toward local populations created relationships of economic dependency and cultural disruption that outlasted the war by decades. The cargo cult phenomenon, the religious and social movements that emerged in Melanesia during and after the war, in which local populations performed rituals intended to summon the material abundance that the American forces had seemed to produce from nowhere, is one of the more striking cultural consequences of the American military's passage through the Pacific. The sight of aircraft landing on improvised airstrips with loads of food and equipment that exceeded anything the local economies could imagine produced interpretations that drew on existing religious frameworks to make sense of phenomena that had no prior frame of reference. The cargo cults are partly amusing and partly poignant as cultural artifacts, and they illuminate something about the encounter between the material wealth of the American military and the material poverty of the Pacific Island populations that neither side of the encounter fully understood at the time. The political consequences of the Pacific War for the Pacific Islands were complex and unresolved. The American presence during and after the war established strategic relationships and military bases that shaped the political development of Pacific Island territories for decades. Some of these territories became American possessions or trust territories: Guam, the Marianas, the Marshall Islands, Palau, with political statuses that reflected the strategic requirements of the American military position in the Pacific rather than the preferences of the local populations. The decolonization processes that followed, some of them negotiated and some of them contested, were long and sometimes painful. The nuclear testing program that the United States conducted in the Marshall Islands after the war, the Bikini Atoll tests of the 1940s and 1950s, added another dimension to the already complex relationship between American strategic requirements and the lives of Pacific Island peoples. The Bikinians who were relocated to make way for the nuclear tests were told they would be able to return when the tests were complete. The radiation contamination of Bikini Atoll has prevented their return to this day. The legal and moral claims of the displaced Bikinians against the United States government have been acknowledged in principle and inadequately addressed in practice for decades. The island hopping strategy, viewed from the perspective of the islands themselves rather than from the perspective of American strategic planning, was a series of events that happened to people who had no say in where the war went or what it cost. The Okinawans, whose island was chosen as the final stepping stone before Japan, who died in numbers approaching 100,000 in a battle they had not asked to be part of, in a conflict between powers that regarded their island primarily as a military objective. Their experience of the island hopping campaign was different from the American Marines' experience, and different again from the Japanese soldiers' experience. And all three perspectives are part of the truth of what happened. The men who designed the island hopping strategy, Nimitz and his planning staff, King and the Joint Chiefs in Washington, the operational commanders who executed each individual operation, were doing their jobs with the information and the resources and the strategic objectives they had been given. They made decisions under conditions of uncertainty and pressure that produced outcomes ranging from brilliant to questionable. The overall result, the defeat of Japan in the Pacific, achieved at a cost that was terrible but that was less than the alternatives available, was a success by any historical measure. The human cost of that success, distributed across the populations of islands from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, is the full accounting that the strategic success requires. The Pacific War ended not on a beach, but above a city, with the detonation of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, and the subsequent Japanese surrender on August 15th. The island hopping campaign had made those events possible by bringing American forces within range of Japan and by creating the conditions, the isolation, the interdiction, the destruction of the Japanese air forces and naval forces that might have prevented the B-29 campaign, under which the atomic bombs could be delivered. Whether the bombs were necessary given the alternative of invasion is a question that historians and ethicists have debated for 80 years and will likely continue to debate. What is not debatable is that the island campaign created the strategic situation within which the question could arise. The islands themselves, most of them, returned to quieter purposes after the war. Guadalcanal is today part of the Solomon Islands nation, a developing country with a small economy and a population that lives largely as its ancestors lived, on an island that the world remembers primarily for a battle fought there 8 decades ago. Tinian is sparsely populated, its wartime airfields mostly overgrown. Paliliu is a small community in the Republic of Palau, visited by divers who come to see the shipwrecks and the coral reefs, and by veterans and their families who come to walk the ground where the Marines fought in 1944. Iwo Jima is a Japanese territory with a small self-defense force garrison and no permanent civilian population. Its volcanic landscape still bearing the marks of the fighting. The strategy that was fought across these islands changed the world. It ended Japanese imperial expansion. It established American strategic presence across the Pacific in ways that have shaped the region's geopolitics for 80 years. It demonstrated the possibilities of large-scale amphibious warfare in ways that military establishments around the world studied and absorbed. And it cost the lives of tens of thousands of young men, American and Japanese and Okinawan, and the citizens of every island nation whose land became a battlefield, who deserved better than to die on a Pacific island for the ambitions of governments they had no say in. That is the island-hopping war, fight out across 60 million square miles of ocean, step by step toward a conclusion that was determined in the factories, in the shipyards, and the intelligence basements before the last beach was taken. The men who crossed those beaches knew none of this. They knew only the beach in front of them. They crossed it anyway. That is what the war required, and that is what they gave. The question of what the island-hopping campaign meant for American strategic thinking in the decades after the war is one that military historians and strategists have returned to repeatedly. The campaign demonstrated, in practical terms, the viability of large-scale amphibious operations against defended positions, something that had been seriously questioned after the disasters of Gallipoli in the First World War. It demonstrated the decisive potential of carrier aviation, which had displaced a battleship as the primary instrument of naval power in ways that transformed the concept of sea control and power projection. It demonstrated the importance of logistics, the ability to sustain forces across oceanic distances, as a determinant of strategic outcome rather than just a background enabler of combat operations. These lessons were absorbed by the American military establishment and shaped the strategic concepts and force structures that would define American military power for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. The amphibious capability that the Marine Corps developed and maintained, the ships, the aircraft, the doctrine, the training, is a direct legacy of the Pacific Island Campaign. The Carrier Strike Group that is a primary instrument of American naval power today, the large deck carrier surrounded by escort vessels, capable of projecting air power thousands of miles from any shore base, is a direct descendant of the fast carrier task forces that fought their way across the Pacific. The islands themselves became, over the post-war decades, the geography of a different kind of American presence in the Pacific. The bases that American forces established on Guam and in the Marianas, and at other strategic points became the logistics and forward presence infrastructure of the American strategic position in Asia, the foundation of the alliances and the forward deployments that have shaped the security environment of the Pacific for 80 years. The strategic logic that drove the island-hopping campaign in 1943 and 1944, the recognition that controlling specific islands in the Pacific confers the ability to project power across the ocean, remains as valid today as it was when Nimitz's planning staff was drawing the lines on the maps. The men who fought the island campaign are almost all gone now. The last of them are very old, their numbers diminishing each year. Their specific memories of specific beaches and specific battles and specific comrades becoming less accessible to historical record as the witnesses pass. The photographs and the documents and the oral histories that have been preserved constitute the record that will remain when the last veteran is gone, a record that is rich and detailed in some respects and inevitably incomplete in others, because no record can fully capture what was to cross a beach at Tarawa or climb the slopes of Suribachi or clear caves on Paliliu in the summer of 1944. What the record can preserve, and what this episode has tried to convey, is the shape of the thing, the strategy which was right and which worked, the cost, which was real and immense and should not be minimized in the celebration of the victory, the people, American and Japanese and Okinawan, and the citizens of every island nation whose land became a battlefield, who bore that cost without having chosen to be in the path of the war, and the specific moments and specific battles that give the abstract strategy its human content. The Marines wading to the beach at Bidio, the flag raised on Suribachi, the kamikazes diving at the fleet off Okinawa, the bypass garrisons on their isolated islands waiting for a relief that never came, across 60 million square miles. That is the island-hopping war. The Pacific Island Campaign also produced, in the men who fought it, a particular kind of veteran, one shaped by experiences that were qualitatively different from those of the men who fought in Europe. The jungle, the heat, the disease, the particular ferocity of the Japanese defenders, the isolation of island garrisons thousands of miles from the nearest familiar reference point, These things marked the Pacific veterans differently from the veterans of a European theater, and the difference was visible to people who knew both groups. It was not better or worse. It was different in ways that the word veteran does not fully capture, and that the general category of World War II service does not distinguish. The men who were on Tarawa and the men who were on Omaha Beach were both veterans of the Second World War. They were also veterans of experiences that had almost nothing in common except the year and the uniform and the outcome. Both deserved to be understood in their own terms for what they specifically experienced and what it cost them specifically, rather than subsumed into a single narrative of the greatest generation that makes the particularity of their suffering and their courage invisible in the generality of the category. The island-hopping war was its own thing. It happened to specific people in specific places and caused specific things. That is the story this episode has tried to tell.